It is really a coincidence that two of my students are here today as speakers. Really, I was not aware until really the program was printed. One former, he graduated about 19 years ago. I can still see Ciro in the classroom of my, I think he took all my courses that I offered at the time. So, great student. And a current student who is Suen, who is writing a thesis with me, and who wrote a junior paper last year on Beccaria, which got the university prize for best junior paper. Suen is a senior, as I said, in the Italian department. She's also pursuing a certificate in translation and intercultural communication, and has just returned from spending a spring semester studying at the University of Padua. She not only speaks English, obviously, but she speaks Cantonese with her parents. She speaks Spanish with her friends in Florida, where she lives. She speaks Italian with me. And she's learning Venetian dialect, which is part of her research. So I'm very proud and happy to introduce Suen.
Grazie, buongiorno a tutti. I'm very glad to be following on the footsteps of two history lectures because I actually have another piece of reading for you guys to add to your reading list. But perhaps I should begin with a prelude as to my own experiences with Italian history and my story of how a 20-something Chinese American from Jacksonville, Florida, ends up studying all things Italian. Now, my freshman year at Princeton, I began taking Italian courses with the wonderful professors at Princeton. And I love learning languages, but I think at that point in my development, I had only a tangential interest in Italy. And I know that sounds almost blasphemous, but I simply had limited exposure to the country. And I was also taking a lot of politics and ethics courses at the time. And in fact, I considered majoring in politics before I made the right decision and joined the Italian department. And I was very interested in the theories that we have in this country about coercion and other violations of American civil liberties, and how much this has changed in the post-9/11 period. But during the course of my readings, none of the authors we read, absolutely none of them, convincingly incorporated both pragmatic and theoretical reasons against torture until I read Beccaria's work. And it was actually in Professor Frassica's course, Italian 220, that I was first introduced to the world of political theory from an Italian context. And in keeping with the theme of this year's conference, Italians in the Making of America, I want to explore the power of ideas that still have the potential to shape America today. Cesare Beccaria's name isn't very well known outside the circle of 18th century jurisprudence, yet we indirectly enjoy the fruits of his labor. He was very much a man of the Enlightenment in the Milanese intellectual circle of the day. As you probably remember, Beccaria was the grandfather of Alessandro Manzoni, the famous author of I Promessi Sposi, or The Betrothed in English. While Beccaria never had the same level of literary fame as his famous grandson, his work was responsible for sparking an international debate on the politics of torture and the death penalty. In his treatise on crimes and punishment, that's the title you guys need to write down to read later on, he argues for the abolition of torture on both philosophical and practical grounds. More than that, though, and this is important, he was one of the few political philosophers of his day, Italian or otherwise, who took an acute sociological interest in applying the law equally to all levels of society. His writings are studied by scholars not only in political science, but also in sociology and philosophy, because his work was very influential, like I said, during the 18th century, and because they are still salient today, and we have much to learn from his ideas. Now, many of you might be wondering, while we still have the death penalty in this country, why even focus on torture? Isn't putting someone to death qualitatively worse than physically hurting them for a short amount of time? Well, the simple answer is no. For better or worse, we've gotten a lot better at both executing and torturing people in the past few centuries. However, our improvements on the death penalty in this country are meant to reduce the amount of pain we cause on someone. And this in itself doesn't drastically change the moral dilemma we're faced with. It's still the same problems that Beccaria argued about in the 18th century. However, the development of capital punishment, especially in the Western European and in American countries, is notably different from the trajectory torture has taken since the 18th century. And this is mostly because the very nature of torture means that any improvement we make in efficiency means inflicting more or different kinds of psychological and physical pain on someone else. And this problem has only gotten more complex because we've gotten attached to the idea that we can torture for national security. And because policymakers in this country are unable or unwilling to take a compromising moral stance on this issue. The result is, despite ample reasons to reconsider our position on torture, the United States continues these practices without realizing the true costs on democratic society. Before 9/11, very few people would have championed it as an effective method of information gathering. However, as we can see from the recent scandals at Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib, it's no longer a question of really whether torture is morally compromising for us, but instead it's become more of a question of what are the acceptable parameters for this sort of behavior. Not only has the focus of this debate shifted, but people are instead concentrating their efforts on painting a veneer of respectability on torture. Now, regardless of what your personal stance might be on this matter, I think our current situation warrants a good opportunity to reopen a frank and open discussion on torture. There are a number of reasons why Beccaria's on crime and punishments emerged when it did. The 18th century really wasn't a good century for Italy politically. The country was divided into many territories by the Spanish, the French, and the Austrians, but the city of Milan in particular drew a relatively lucky hand. Under the Austrian Empire, the city became a cosmopolitan center and the origin of many revolutionary ideas. The Empress Maria Theresa and the appointed governor of Milan, Count Firmian, began an enormous project of public works, reforming the educational and the economic systems, renovating the city, even installing a modern waste management system similar to the ones we have today that drastically decreased the outbreak of disease in the city. And it was under this new Austrian regime that Milan entered the era of the Enlightenment and transformed itself into a dynamic modern city. Sometimes, as I'm sure you've noticed from everyday life, the right conditions make all the difference. And suddenly things are possible that weren't before. It was because of this open atmosphere and the spirit of reform that young Milanese were able and willing to make important contributions to enlightened thought. The country was really ready for intellectual and social innovation at this point. I mean, it might be difficult for us to imagine what the 18th century was like, but it really wasn't that great. And in this period, poverty was a condition that was without any realistic solution, because aside from Catholic charities, there was no widespread social safety net or public welfare system to take care of the poor. And the dismal social conditions that most Italians faced became shockingly apparent during the Tuscan famines of 1767. There was a vast divide in Italian society in this period. The urban upper classes, well, almost all of the urban upper classes, as we'll see with Beccaria, didn't know or simply didn't care about the suffering of rural towns and villages under this crisis. Among the younger generation of thinkers, fortunately, there was a greater sensitivity to the social inequalities and a desire to correct them. Thanks to printing technologies, which made the international marketplace of ideas much more accessible, young Milanese thinkers created their own society called the Accademia dei Pugni, or the Academy of Fists. And this was a circle of free thinkers who created their own hub of the Enlightenment right in Milan, and even published their own magazine, Il Caffè, which featured literary, legal, political, and socioeconomic discourse on the issues of the time. And it is among these set of young thinkers that we find Beccaria, who is already well known by this time for his research on Milan's currency problems. I mean, he was a civil servant, so he had obviously dealt with the government of Milan, and he was also an economist. He was a very great reader. He drew from the theoretical framework of the British philosopher John Locke, as well as the French political scientists Rousseau, Montesquieu, and Helvetius. And it was really this set of readings and this reformist streak that eventually led him to write On Crimes and Punishment in 1764. Now, to us today, it might seem obvious that torture is repellent for a number of reasons. However, we only feel this way because we've been relatively spoiled compared to people from past centuries. Torture as a legal practice dates back to the days of canon law. The need for certainty in court often meant that full proofs, or as we would call it, a full set of evidence, would have been needed to convict someone of a crime. However, because it was very, very difficult to furnish complete evidence of a crime, torture as a means of obtaining a confession often became a common practice during this period. Canon law, however, and this is rather ironic, was structured in such a way that it was meant to reduce the uncertainty in how the law was applied, and it was meant to make it less arbitrary. This meant that conviction was on the basis of proofs, and a whole proof, which is what most prosecutors would seek for capital punishment, would consist of 2 witnesses or an admission of guilt from the accused. However, if a whole proof couldn't be obtained, for instance, if the prosecutor could only find 1 witness or this witness was unreliable, then there was this sort of mix and match approach by people on different levels, whereby the accused could be tortured to obtain a confession that would complete the proof. Now, ironically, this system and the way it was actually carried out in practice often meant that the tortured man's confession ensured his own execution. And for Beccaria, this is the height of absurdity. States gained their very legitimacy through serving the people who give them the power to rule. And the state, in turn, was supposed to protect the interests of these people, and especially, and this is important for a lot of political thinkers, it was meant to protect them from random violence. Now, if you think about it, if torture is random violence done to people by the state, even before they've been committed of a crime, at this point they've just been accused, then the state has failed in its most basic task and has defied the reason for its existence. But what makes Beccaria's argument against capital punishment truly revolutionary is his firm belief in reason as a wider qualification of personhood. Reason was a uniquely human attribute that did not discriminate on the basis of class or blood. Now, if this doesn't seem revolutionary to you guys at first, let's put it into context. Consider that in the US on the eve of the Civil War, one of the justifications for brutality towards slaves was that they only understood corporal punishment. They didn't understand reason. And the argument went that slaves, being racially inferior to whites, were somehow deprived by nature of reason and only understood physical pain. And this should strike us as horrifying today. But we have to remember that this line of thinking was once the norm for the period. Stripping someone of their reason strips them of their humanity. And it takes a truly circumspect and compassionate writer, like Beccaria, to go against centuries of thinking in order to propose something new. Now, as a philosopher, but also as an enlightened citizen, Beccaria was constantly striving to reconcile these idealistic concepts with an imperfect and human society. And it's his capacity to empathize with a lot of people that distinguishes him from many political philosophers of the day. Now, Beccaria sees human nature as essentially good, but corrupted through centuries of bad practices, which obviously includes torturing as an important element of the legal system. In his treatise, he often speaks directly to the accused man of the lower classes, someone who felt very, very acutely the arbitrarity of the law. He writes, and I quote, "The laws torment you because you are guilty, because you could be guilty, because they would like for you to be guilty." Now, whether this is genuine sympathy for the accused or simply some sort of rhetorical flourish on his part, Beccaria's attention to the conditions of the poor is especially notable because during this time period, these classes were completely marginalized from any sort of political discourse, and they were practically invisible to most legislators. And I think it's important to remember also that Beccaria was born to the upper class, so if he wanted to, he could go his entire life without thinking about or looking at poor people. But that's not what he did. He engages with the people who are most affected by policies such as torture. Now, torture and coercion in a legal context flew in the face of the values represented by the Enlightenment. In a system that incorporated torture as some sort of legal proof, physical endurance, and not the truth, became the foundation of justice. On a practical level, this simply did not work. it meant that your guilt was directly correlated to your pain threshold. I mean, if you can imagine, let's say we have a physically very strong person who can withstand torture without confessing. He would basically go off scotch-free, even though he might be guilty. Moreover, the practice of torture produced false confessions. It's not difficult to imagine that, faced with the prospect of torture, I'm sure many of us would opt for any temporary measure to avoid pain, including telling our torturers what they want to hear. And this happens even today. For instance, I give you guys the case of Fuad Mahmoud al-Rawaya, who was a Kuwaiti man detained in Guantanamo Bay from 2002 all the way until 2009. He was interrogated about 200 times based on the documentation we have during his years in detention. And by interrogation, I mean all the bells and whistles. So sleep deprivation, intimidation of prisoner. It wasn't just like a normal job interview sort of situation. And partly due to this immense coercion involved, he began giving false confessions to crimes he never committed, just to get his interrogators to stop. And these were not small crimes that he confessed to. He confessed to smuggling himself into Afghanistan to join Osama bin Laden, which was physically impossible for him once they went over the evidence of where he was during these years. So besides being just morally objectionable, coercion and torture are just plain unreliable. And I think it's funny, but also kind of sad, that Beccaria realized almost 250 years before we did, that torture is a completely fallible means of gaining information. Now you might be wondering, what does this all mean for us? Although On Crimes and Punishment was banned until 1962, Beccaria's work inspired an immense set of penal reforms across Europe and in early America. Even before the reunification of Italy, the Gran Ducato of Toscana became the first place in Italy and in Europe to abolish the death penalty. And they did it citing Beccaria's reasoning that capital punishment is simply ineffective. Elsewhere, for example, in Germany and Poland, the reform spirit also took root. Today, the death penalty is almost entirely abolished in Western Europe, and this is thanks to Beccaria's treatise and the response it inspired on an international level. In the context of American political theory, however, Beccaria's contribution is largely understated outside the academic world, and this is due primarily to two factors, well, maybe three, I believe. Firstly, Beccaria's treatise sort of missed the boat to the New World due to a problem of translation. There simply weren't that many good English language translations of his treatise, and what few translations there were didn't really get widely disseminated until later on. Fortunately, we can remedy this today through the power of a good translation, and if any of you are interested, I can recommend a few, because a good translation can reintroduce a frank discussion of Beccaria's ideas in the English-speaking world, and in particular in the United States. Secondly, and this was more of a historic reason, we have to remember that this was a period of immense social revolution in Europe. And the result was that many authoritarian regimes, including the Austrian Empire in Milan, kind of really clamped down on these revolutionary ideas, which slowed but didn't stop their diffusion in Europe. Thirdly, and this is still true today based on my own exposure with most political science and ethics courses, is that there's this sad tendency to treat anything inspired by Rousseau's social contract as solely a derivative work. Like anything that comes from the Enlightenment is just Rousseau's party. And this simply isn't true in most cases, and especially not for Beccaria. Beccaria went further than Rousseau ever did. Rousseau, in his famous work on the social contract, sanctions the death penalty out of necessity as a means of defending the state from renegades. Beccaria, on the other hand, is much more compassionate. He believed that even criminals were part of the state, that the state had no right to execute them because they were still full citizens, and that no one, not even the most hardened criminal, should be defined by the worst mistake they ever made. In spite of all of these barriers, Beccaria's influence is indisputable. His ideas are both universal and timeless. In true Enlightenment spirit of the 18th century, his ideas caused a ripple effect that spread outward from Milan into the far corners of Europe and finally to the United States. Unlike in Europe, however, the United States has not abolished the death penalty and seems reluctant to even discuss torture of any kind. If anything, the current state of affairs should encourage more open dialogue about the moral and practical reasons for the status quo. Now, Ciro's speech mentioned the importance of Italians and Italian-American thought in the founding of America. But Beccaria's project is still unfinished, and this is where all of you come in. With a good translation and with more attempts to engage the public, we can bring back these ideas, which are still salient, out of the 18th century and into the modern day to spark more open discourse. Thank you.